Welcome to Whatif tutorials. In this tutorial we'll be creating a quote header. First we'll be looking at quote numbering, then we'll be looking at quote defaults, and then we will create our quote header. From the product quotes menu, select quote numbering. This number here is the next number the system will create or allocate to the next quote that you create. If you are going to change this number, always make it a future number. Do not go backwards, because that may involve doubling up quotes that have already been created under a previous number. Once you've set this, the system will increment it by 1 every time you create a new quote. Click Defaults, Other Defaults. In here we have several quote defaults. The first one is the factory. If you have more than one factory, you still can create quotes for any one factory, but you need to specify a default factory here. Next we have the option to yes or no to print dimensions. If you don't have dimensions, then obviously you would say no. If you do have dimensions, you probably would say yes. This involves printing the dimensions in words as well as in quantity below the description on the quote. And for each quote you can, irrespective of this default, for each quote you can change it on the quote to yes or no. Similarly for printing the long description, yes or no. Next we have whether freight is applicable to, whether GST is applicable to freight, yes or no. Next we have quote lead time. This is the time between the acceptance by the customer of the quote and the delivery to him. Next we have quote lapse time. This is the time from the date of submission to a time where the quote is considered to be lapsed. That is, all attempts to get a decision from the customer have failed, and no further time will be wasted, or little time should be wasted on that quote. Next we have footer remarks. These are remarks that appear at the foot of the quote, and they apply only to plain paper quotes. They don't apply to pre-printed quotes, because the pre-printed quotes should cover those on the form itself at the foot. We can then select from several pre-created footer remarks, the one we want to use as a default. Next we have the referral source. The referral source you can choose from your list. That'll be the default for the referral. Attachments refer to a single page of text and or image that can be created for an item in the quote. So if you have several items on the quote, you can have one or more attachments for each item. The purpose of the attachment is to add more information to the quote other than the bare quote details. Click your green arrow to select. None would be your choice if the attachment text on quotes was specific to each quote. If you were going to have no standard sort of text attached at all, it's just the text as required. If, however, you have some sort of standard text that applies to a particular range of products and another lot of standard text that applies to another range of products, then you can use these, and you can use one of these as a default, so that when you create the quote it'll bring in the standard text in relation to that. Next we have the number of decimals in the sales quantity. Normally this would be none, but if you want 1, 2 or 3 decimals you can have them, and that'll be the default for the decimals, but we'll stay with none. Save that. Okay, we're now ready to create the quote header. You should have covered the master files in particular customers in a previous tutorial, and you should have created your items in the item master file of the standard costing module. because the quote simply selects items from the item master. So click Create Quotes, and we have in here in the yellow section each quote that exists. We will now click Create Quote, select a customer, or you can add a new customer here as you go. We won't do that because that was covered in the customer master file tutorial. We'll simply use a customer that exists. When you bring the customer in, it brings with it all of the defaults in the customer master file plus the defaults which we just dealt with. You can change any of these that have a green arrow. You can change a bill address. You can create a new bill address that is particular to this quote as you go, and likewise with the delivery address you can create a new one as you go. Okay. The shipping method is the default. The quote remarks are the default we talked about. Customer reference. This is a reference number applicable or applied by the customer. You have your phone numbers, fax, email, printing quote totals. Usually yes. If you want to change it to no, that would only be the case where there's no total because you are looking at options within the quote. You might have $100,000 as option A and $150,000 as option B, so the total is irrelevant. It's simply one or the other. However, in most cases we would expect there to be a single option with a total. Prices inclusive of GST, yes or no. We'll say no. And now here we have an estimate by the system of the number of pages required. When you print the quote, it'll try to estimate how many pages are required. The system doesn't know how many pages were actually required until it finishes printing, but it needs to have a guess at that as it prints. So it uses the variables information that you've put in the quote layout section, where you have identified the number of lines and the number of characters per line, and from that the system works out the number of pages that it thinks it will take. Up here we have the follow-up section. You have your contact name, his greeting, the contact phone, last date contacted if any, the follow-up date that you want to follow this quote up, the status by default is draft, and once you have it approved, you can change it to approved. Once it's submitted, you change it to submitted and enter your submission date. That's the date it was submitted. And then we have the lapse date and the estimated delivery date following on from what you've entered using the default days we talked about earlier. The result, when you create the quote, it's pending unless you know that it's been accepted, of course, or rejected. But if it's been rejected, maybe you didn't want to create it in the first place. Maybe deferred and so on, and lapsed. But at this stage it would be pending. When you do receive notification from the customer, you need to put in an advised date when you therefore change the result from, you must have left it pending, and you can change that date when the change occurs. Okay, terms. These are the terms that come from the item master file. You can select from the various options and enter or change the discount on prompt payment, the number of days net, number of days discount, and there's the term text. Okay, comments. You can put comments in about the quote. These comments can be updated as you go along to record a log of what's happening with you and the customer in relation to the quote. So that concludes the creation of the quote. So what we have here is a quote with no sales cost or margin because we haven't entered any quote lines in. We'll do that in another tutorial. So that concludes this tutorial.